series. Tonight's guest is Seymour Hersh, prize-winning author and journalist, investigative journalist, who's written for the New York Times and written a number of books, from the My Lai massacre to his recent book on the Korean Airlines Flight 007, to tonight's topic, the Iran-Contra affair. Mr. Hersh has made a career out of finding the truth behind the headlines. And now, without further ado, I'd like to present Mr. Seymour Hersh.
This is so weird. I'm so far back, but that's the way it is. Apparently, if we get closer, the mic squeals, somebody said. As best as I can, I think I'll just try and tell you what's on my mind, and we'll do some questions. I should say that I'm actually in the middle of a book, not so much on the Iran-Contra affair, but on the foreign policy of Reagan. And as such, I have a lot of ideas on the press and its role in society, which I'm qualified to talk about. And basically, I've been following the issue very closely. Before I begin, I ought to say to those of you who haven't caught up with the news tonight that it is true that the White House announced, I guess late this afternoon, that the 82nd Airborne and a battalion of Marines have successfully invaded Luxembourg and will be going ashore at Monaco tomorrow. It's my little funny way of talking a little bit about, sort of beginning by talking about another issue that's very interesting, obviously Grenada. Some of you might remember the famous Grenada invasion of 1983, which was subsequently described as a great success. We proved, I guess, basically that no nation with a population of fewer than 400,000 is safe from American democracy. I don't know what else we proved. It was an amazing experience, if you think about it. Grenada's population is 110,000, roughly the size of the Rose Bowl. That many people fit into the Rose Bowl once a year. And son of a gun, we beat them. It was a great victory. And maybe the students that we were told were in peril, maybe they really weren't in peril, but that was a minor fact. Maybe there really wasn't 2,000 Cuban, armed-to-the-teeth Cuban warriors there, but that's beside the fact. Maybe it took the 82nd Airborne something like 4 days to go 3 miles, but that was beside the fact. What happened is we accepted very jingoistically, and I think the American press, although squealing and yelling about not being included in the battle plans, basically behaved, I guess, as any press would in any country at war. Even horrors, Tanzug, the Yugoslavian press agency, or TASS, the Soviet press agency. I would say that it's very hard to differentiate the great American democratic free press from some of the mouthpiece press when it comes to something like Grenada, an incident in which the President of the United States said that met every standard of international law because we've been asked in by other countries in the Eastern Caribbean. Sort of the rule of law espoused by the President in explaining the invasion was that you had asked you to beat up you, and that's okay. Well, history's going to be very, very tough on Grenada, and the underpinnings of it, and the whole story isn't in. What I'm saying, I guess, is my way of looking at the Reagan administration is a little different. I don't focus on Iran-Contra. My own instinct is that what went wrong in this government probably went wrong very early, probably as soon as they got into office. That seems to be the pattern. People tend to behave in a consistent way that as administrations do. They don't change their colors very often. And I think let me just postulate this to you. If Robert McFarlane, and I'm assuming some level of knowledge about the Iran-Contra affair, McFarlane was the former National Security Advisor that had been asked to go back in by the President to John Poindexter, then the National Security Advisor, to go to Tehran last year. And in Tehran, he was going to negotiate, trade some weapons. He flew in from Israel, trade some weapons for some hostages that were held by various factions, Shiite factions, in Beirut, over which we believe the Iranians had a lot of control. One of the immediate hitches, of course, is that, as McFarlane discovered, the Iranians were basically rug traders. And when he got there, they told him right away that they wanted more weapons if they were going to produce some hostages. I guess we really didn't get down to, if you give us 30 more weapons, we'll give you 2 legs or 2 arms. We didn't get that close to that, but it was a lot of rough trading, a lot of rough talking. But I wonder what would happen, and it precipitated, McFarlane left, the thing fell apart eventually, a newspaper in Beirut told us about it, and that's how we first learned. I wonder what would have happened if McFarlane had made it. Suppose we'd gone in there and they'd asked for more weapons, or suppose they were more satisfied with the weapons we gave them. We didn't give them the best we had. The TOW missiles, TOW missiles we gave them were not the most sophisticated. There's other more sophisticated level of missiles that we did not give the Iranians, and I'm sure they knew it. Suppose McFarlane had been successful. It's my belief that he probably would have, the plan called for him to come back to Washington with the hostages. Suppose 3 or 4 people did pop out of Beirut. He would have gone to Washington. There would have been a ceremony in the White House lawn, and maybe the Ayatollah would have been praised to the sky for his cooperation. Maybe it wouldn't have been mentioned. But the bottom line is it would have gone down. I think it would have gone down very easily if he had gotten it back and even indicated the Iranians had helped. I think all of us would not have looked, since we're such a country of getting things done, I think all of us would have not have looked very far, much further. We would have settled. We had an immediate success. We got our hostages back, and that would have made most of us happy. And the underlying problem that we were negotiating, in effect, in secret against our policy, running a policy in secret totally diametrically opposed to our public policy, I think wouldn't have been much of a player. Well, in all of this, there's some interesting things for me as somebody who's been in Washington for 20 years, mostly, and somebody who's been reading and watching presidents for a long time. I think basically we're up the creek in our country in terms of what we in the press can do for you. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about our role, how good we are, how bad we are, whether we're the messengers or whether the public's tired of the affair or not. I think the issue transcends the press immediately, the problem in this country. And it gets down to some of the basic things we want from a president, we expect from the president, the standards we hold him to. And I think if you go back, I'll go back just as far as the Cold War. It's my belief that since the advent of the Cold War and the notion that American policy was fueled in anti-Sovietism, anti-Russian policy, not necessarily anti-communism policy, because we can live with the communists in China and elsewhere if we have to, anti-Soviet style communism. I think you can almost run a straight line in the foreign policy of all of our presidents. I don't think the foreign policy of any president, basically from Truman on down, has been significantly different. The core of the policy has always been basically anti-communism. When pushed, when shoved. Jimmy Carter tried to be a little different. In the end, he had his Iran caper too. I think ultimately two basic, I'm not saying there's not enormous differences between a Mondale and a Reagan on social issues, or whoever's going to be the next candidate for the Republicans and the Democrats on all of the issues that I think are very important too, obviously. Student loans, welfare, farm issues. But separating out those, the foreign policy is amazingly uniform. And you see a couple of amazing trends, I think. One of them is that we've given our presidents basically two divine rights in foreign policy. One of them is the right to send our sons and daughters, pluck them from our house, send you people into combat without meeting any of the constitutional prerequisites. And actually there's legislation now, the War Powers Act of 1973 also has another burden on the president. Informing Congress, getting their consent in advance. We've abrogated that right to the president. That's almost a divine right of the presidency. He can send us anywhere, explain it later, whether it's in Grenada or if they have to go to into Iran tomorrow, he'll just do it and ask questions first, or into Nicaragua. He'll do it first and then come back for the sanction. The secondary and sort of obvious corollary divine right is the right to lie to us about it. And I think if you go back through history, you'll find that the American presidents have, without any blinking at all on foreign policy, have lied to us. Jack Kennedy lied to us about Laos. Richard Nixon, all the way. We can talk about him forever. Lyndon Johnson about the initial Vietnam caper, the intrusion, our incursion into the Dominican Republic in 1965. Jimmy Carter had his Iran Desert One, the scandal, the flop in the desert when he tried to rescue the hostages. Jerry Ford had his Mayaguez. Some of you might remember the freight, the group of American sailors that were seized by a Cambodian force in 1975. 41 Marines were killed trying to free them after they'd already been freed. We knew they'd been freed. We still sent the Marines in, some of them to die because we needed to show a force. We just lost the war in Vietnam. Reagan's had, as I said, his Grenada, his Marines in Lebanon. Why more people aren't angry at Reagan for killing 241 Marines in Lebanon is a great mystery to me. In all of this, there are some sort of sad truths. One of them is, as I said, we're all loyal. It's a wonderful country. America is a very unique place. It's the kind of place in which somebody like me can go around and make a living and be successful, criticizing my government openly and giving them a lot of grief and being and being taken seriously for it, not being thrown in jail. We all recognize and appreciate the enormous freedoms we have. However, there's some very, I think, terribly disturbing trends in the way we treat our people and our attitudes towards our people in public life. One obvious thing is, as citizens, we do say to the government, please, if you need, come and take our children, our sons and daughters now, and send them off to basically train them in the art of committing mass murder in the name of democracy and send them off to do it with our blessing. The president has the right to come and take our children and put them in the war. In return, what do we ask from our presidents and our national security leaders? We all know that in our own families, there's nothing as important. As a child, we knew growing up that you don't lie to mother or father on serious issues. Everybody has petty white lies. And as a parent, you learn that one of the things you try not to do, particularly as your children get older, is lie to them, manipulate them. That's, of course, absolutely silly and counterproductive. And as you get older and wiser, you stop doing it as a parent, just as you stop doing it as a child. We all learn in life that the only real true happiness comes with having a partner in life in whom you have enormous confidence and trust. These are all things that we hold very dear in our own life. Our own lives cannot live without them. There's nothing unique or uniquely American or unique that happens around the world. It's normal. And just think about it. The same standards we insist in our own family, our own personal life, we no longer begin to expect or demand from our national leaders. The notion that we would hold Ronald Reagan to the same level of credibility we insist our children, my children on critical issues hold. It's not there. It's a laugh riot. I mean, I think that's a reality. Some of you may still believe in the tooth fairy and have some illusions about some of the things Mr. Reagan says or does, and he's not atypical of presidents. All presidents will lie to us and have. I'm making that point. Reagan's very much in line with what we've had for 30 or 40 years since the Cold War began. And our expectations have fallen so low that the president and the national security advisor can be shown, as they have been, to have manipulated and lied to us repeatedly in the Iran-Contra affair for sure, and in many other affairs. I just wrote a story for the New York Times Magazine a month ago in which I said, like it or don't like it, the famous bombing raid on Libya that we took part in, our F-111s from England, remember that raid? Mrs. Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, was all upset about it, was not really aimed at anything other than the assassination of Gaddafi. That was the main target for 9 of the planes. The mission was to kill him and or his family, both of which he was in a tent, either in a tent or a house a few hundred yards away. The pilots were instructed that they were to bomb both the house and in which he has 8 children and an adopted child, and target them on the grounds. You could target the family. There was a CIA study done saying that you could target the family on the grounds that in Bedouin culture, the desert culture, a man like Gaddafi is diminished even more, whether you get him or don't get him, if he cannot protect his family. So even if you kill his children and wife and children and miss him, you've diminished him in the standing of his countrymen. How such reasoning gets into the White House isn't really clear. I think anything would have gone, I guess, by 1986. The bombs fell. Gaddafi was missed. They hit his tent, but they hit near his tent, missed him. One of his children, an adopted daughter, was killed. Two of his children, a boy 3 and a boy 4, were critically injured and put in intensive care for a few weeks. All 8 children were hospitalized along with his wife. I don't know what honor that does to America to have this go on. I don't know what honor, I don't know what kind of integrity, what kind of process it is to do it and of course cover it in a series of lies as they have done. So I guess what I'm saying is I think we're much further down the road than some of you might, than most people. I think we've been lied to systematically since the man got into office about foreign policy. I think we've been lied to about the policy in South Africa. I think we've been lied to about the policy in the Middle East. I think we've been lied to especially about the policy in Central America. I think obviously we've been lied to about the policy in the Iran-Contra affair, but I think it's deeper. I don't think it's just something that happened. I don't think there was one critical misjudgment in 1985-86 over Iran. I think it's systematic and endemic. And I also think the last place you're going to get the whole story is going to be from the press. And I think the fact that you haven't heard it and the press doesn't tell it to you doesn't mean much. Because there's an awful truth that I've come to, I think it's a truth, and I think I've come to understand it. I'll tell you something. If the President of the United States and his national security advisor, his national security advisor, and his minions lie to us, it's not a unnatural mistake, actually. If the President and the people around him lie to the press, they can get away with anything. And I'm going to give you some evidence. I'm going to give you my view of history on that in a minute to make my point. But hear me out. I think we in the press are absolutely helpless if we have a president who's willing to sustain a lie and a national security apparatus who's willing to go along with it. We can't penetrate. The odds are too hard against this. You cannot believe the bombshells that are lying out there, folks. There have been whole companies of American Rangers put into combat that we don't know about yet. Whether you hear about it or not, whether you can get enough proof, there's an awful lot of stuff that's gone down in this administration and others too, I think. There's been stuff with the Israeli intelligence service that will be very troubling to a lot of Americans if it can get out. And how can I demonstrate to you that in this maze that the press really is sort of more of a bystander than a lot of people want to believe? Our problem is we've been spoiled. Anybody, I can always touch base. I used to talk a lot about the Vietnam Wars. In the introduction you heard I did a story on, I was the first reporter to write about the My Lai massacre. There was a massacre that took place in 1968, almost 20 years ago, in which an army company was parachuted, was helicoptered into what was believed to be a heavy Vietnamese combat area, and they went into a village looking for a fight, and they found anywhere from 345 to 576, depending on whose count, civilians, men, women, children, mostly old men, mostly women and children, gathered around cooking their morning breakfast, their morning rice. About 7 o'clock, they rounded up the people, put them in 3 large groups, and machine gunned them, executed them over about 4 or 5 hours, casual raping along the way. At one point, they stopped and they took a lunch break, and they sat there amidst the bodies eating sea rations. All of this was observed by officers flying above them in various patterns. The air above the operation, the task force was known as Task Force Barker in the northern Vietnam. At 500 feet, the battalion commander. At 1,500 feet, there was the regimental commander. The one-star division commander was at 2,000, and above him was the major general in charge of everything. All were there, all watched. Of course, one lieutenant got prosecuted for it, Lieutenant William Calley. The real lesson is, I started with that, and I used to talk about Vietnam, but you can't talk about, it's funny. It dawned on me when I was growing up in the 40s and 50s in Chicago, World War I was always some sort of distant mirage. It was Flanders Fields and Fields of Poppies and the poems of Sassoon and a few other things, a few novels. And it seems clear now that for most young people who grew up in the late 70s and 80s, Vietnam was your Flanders Field and your Fields of Poppies. It's a distant war. It's hard to relate to it. But what I think you all can relate to is Watergate, if by none other than the mechanism of the movies Everybody here has seen All the President's Men, right? Have you? On home box office, video. Anybody not seen All the President's Men? Redford, Hoffman, Woodward, Bernstein. You know the story about Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Bob Redford and Dustin Hoffman played the starring roles about how they. And here's the storyline. These two intrepid reporters, nothing I say should be in any way meant to denigrate what they did. What they did is outstanding, and they've been appropriately and rewarded for it. And there's not enough we can say about them. They did great stuff. However, the storyline is these two intrepid reporters find out about this bad guy Nixon and write a story, and they bring him down. Great victory for the press. The movie was a big hit, sort of like an ancient version of Rambo, enrollment in journalism schools soared. Everybody got all excited about journalism as a powerful place, a place to shape things. And let me give you my definition of Watergate in light of that movie and the perception you have, in light of the notion that the press actually did in Mr. Nixon. And my notion has the same sort of beginning point as I would argue you could begin with Reagan. I begin on Inauguration Day, on January 20, 1969. Nixon gets elected. Some of this is ancient history for you, so bear with me. You won't remember this, but it was a close election. He beat Hubert Humphrey by a few percentage points, the Democrat. Vietnam was the critical issue, and Nixon, one of his campaign planks was Nixon said, "I have a secret plan to end the war." Well, it turns out he did. After being elected, he decided he was going to win it, which was his secret plan. He was going to win it. And what he was going to do first is let the other guys know, the North Vietnamese, our enemy, that he was tougher than Lyndon Johnson and willing to risk more. He ordered the B-52 fleet, our Strategic Air Command, to begin bombing Cambodia. Cambodia was a neutral country adjacent to South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese and Viet Communist troops, the Viet Cong we call them, would hit us in the south, retreat across the border, and hide out there, safe, a sanctuary. We didn't go across the border. There have been a lot of calls by the military to go across the border in the Johnson era, but Johnson basically acceded to the advice of his Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said, in effect, Mr. President, we're not doing so well in the one war we're in now in the south, why take it to another country? So he never did. Nixon changed the rules. He wanted the B-52s to begin bombing the sanctuaries, but he didn't want anybody to know about it. So he authorized double bookkeeping, basically. He told these pilots that they were to bomb Cambodia and report the bombs inside their own chain of command as being in South Vietnam. Congress was going to vote funds for bombs that were going to fall in Cambodia, but Congress was going to be told the bombs were falling in South Vietnam. So was everybody else inside the military chain of command. Mr. Kissinger, the Secretary of the National Security Advisor, his deputy Al Haig, the erstwhile candidate. As you know, he's coming here soon. I'm sure he'll be here within minutes. As Mort Saul said, he's thrown his helmet into the ring. That'll be an interesting candidacy for sure. Anyway, Haig, Kissinger picked targets. The secret bombing began March 16th, 1969. Nixon had been in office less than 2 months. We began dropping bombs on Cambodia. Next 14 months, 3,630 B-52s go over Cambodia, 110,000 tons of bombs. By the way, everything I'm telling you came out in subsequent investigations. It's all empirical data. Anybody want to challenge me on it, I'll tell you where you can find it, the facts in the various hearings. 110,000 tons of bombs fall in Cambodia in secrecy. In May, 2 months after the secret bombing began, a colleague of mine at the New York Times, Bill Beecher, writes a story about increasing pressure on North Vietnam and accurately says one thing we've done is had a B-52 plane bomb Cambodia. He doesn't say it's systematic. He doesn't say it's been being secretly designed by the White House with the targets picked by Kissinger and Haig and the President. He doesn't say it's been going on for 2 months and is going to continue forever, but the White House doesn't know what else he knows. Out of this story, which made no impact at all in the public, didn't even make the news that night, just another little story in the New York Times, began a 21-month program of illegal and unconstitutional, obviously, wiretapping. 13 members of the government, including people like the closest aide to the Secretary of State and the closest aide to the Secretary of Defense were wiretapped. Kissinger's own staff, 5-6 people in his own staff were wiretapped. 4 newsmen, among them Marvin Cal, just recently signed a contract to go to Harvard and head up some center there. Then with CBS were wiretapped. 21 months, the taps ran till February of 71, in secret. In May, 14 months later, 1970, some of you remember this, we invaded Cambodia. Nixon authorized ground troops to go into Cambodia. Some of you might remember Kent State. The students were shot and killed at Kent State, the 4 students, by the National Guard. The country went up in smoke. It's hard to believe it now, but at that time we were very politically involved in this country. The Vietnam War was very much on everybody's fingertips. Nixon went on television to talk to us about it. He had an American flag in his lapel and a portrait of Lincoln behind him, and of course sweat on his brow, and a heavy beard, every cliche, and a big nose. He's actually Nixon of all the people is the most interesting to me. He's so bright, and very bright and very, I think, evil. Nixon tells us that we have never violated the neutrality of Cambodia. At this point, he's put 110,000 tons of bombs, 14 months of bombs on Cambodia, B-52 bombers. And he looks us in the eye and he says, this is the first time we've ever violated the neutrality. I don't know what's worse, his lie or the fact that he knew he could get away with it. Bad summer for Nixon, if you remember. It was a terrible summer, anti-war demonstrations. He was worried about being renominated for the election for the presidency by his own party, according to his memoirs. He nominates 2 candidates for the Supreme Court, Hainsworth and Carswell. Both get rejected. If you think about it, that almost never happens. Even Ed Meese, with all of the questions about his credentials, sailed through the Senate. You don't reject the president's candidate. The last one who had been rejected was Lewis Strauss in the Eisenhower administration for Secretary of Commerce. He's in big trouble. He goes down and dirty. He orders the CIA to go after Allende in Chile. He thinks Allende's election in Chile, Salvador Allende Gossens is elected as a socialist leader of Chile. He thinks that's dangerous. Even though every agency tells him there's no problem, he goes after Allende. He also orders the CIA to begin operating in secret against American anti-war students and black students. The CIA begins a program that would lead to files, I think more than 100,000 dossiers collected by 1974 when there was subsequent investigations. In the spring of 71, Daniel Ellsberg publishes the Pentagon Papers, former Pentagon aide, advisor to the Robert McNamara. The White House goes bongo over this. A secret police unit, G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, the White House Plumbers, if you remember that group, is set up, operating out of the White House just like Oliver North did and John Poindexter. They begin going after Ellsberg. They break into the office of a psychoanalysis in Beverly Hills in September 1971, obviously looking for evidence that he was linked to the KGB or what. To recruit this, to do the break-in, Hunt and Liddy, Hunt out of the CIA, Liddy out of the FBI, both working for the White House, go back to old CIA hands from the Bay of Pigs with whom Hunt had worked. Hunt was a longtime operative, had been working in the Bay of Pigs for the CIA. 5 Cuban Americans are brought out to California. Guys by the name of Sturgis, Gonzalez, Barker, Martinez, and they help plan the operation. It's supposed to be a covert break-in into the office of the psychoanalyst. His name is Louis Fielding. But of course, everything goes wrong. They made a wax key, but the key didn't work. The building was under guard. They ended up using a crowbar to get into the window. They ended up using get into the office and a crowbar to get into the files. And afterwards, they realized they hadn't gone in covertly, so they took a 1,000-tablet jar of Emperor tablets, smashed it, and threw it around the room, obviously trying to suggest to the police that a junkie looking for an Emperor fix came in and had burglarized the office. Lord knows why they did it. What I'm telling you was in public record in a grand jury proceeding in a county grand jury proceeding in L.A. Big deal. Some guy gets caught. A local black guy gets busted a couple weeks later for the break-in and is sent to jail, where he remained till after Watergate. The group disbands. In April, Nixon and the people decide they want to get some intelligence on the White House. On the Democratic National Committee. Larry O'Brien, the former Johnson aide, runs the National Committee. They have offices in the Watergate office building. They ask Hunt and Liddy to go and do a wiretap. Hunt and Liddy turned to the 5 Cuban Americans again, who trot up this time not to L.A. but to Washington. They buy equipment. They penetrate the offices in the Watergate at night. They put bugs in. to the phones there in the offices, and they leave, go back home. Two things wrong with the bug. One, it doesn't work for more than a few weeks, and secondly, it's in the wrong office. They're not getting Larry O'Brien, but they're getting a deputy. In May 72, J. Edgar Hoover dies, the FBI director. Daniel Ellsberg, none other, comes to lead an anti-war demonstration, in part to celebrate his death, I presume. That's Nixon's interpretation. He orders action taken against Ellsberg. This comes from the Watergate prosecutor proceedings, never made public at the time because Nixon was pardoned, if you remember, before they had a chance to prosecute this fully. The 5 Cuban Americans, Hunt and Liddy, again are called on to do it, their track record being so sterling, everything they've done have been so wonderful. They're called again, and this time Sturgis later tells a federal grand jury that the orders were not to sort of kill Ellsberg, but just sort of, break a leg or beat him up or something. And they start a fight at the rally where Ellsberg is speaking. Sturgis and Gonzalez and Barker Martinez, the Cuban Americans brought up for it, the same 5, don't get to Ellsberg. They fight with other people. If you know Dan Ellsberg and ever heard him talk, he probably never even noticed it as he talked. The fight going on, a few feet below him. And eventually a bunch of people are arrested and released the next day on White House. Somebody comes along with Secret Service passes and releases him. In June, they decide to do something. The election's coming up in 4 months about the no good, no working bug on Larry O'Brien's phone. And they ask John Mitchell, we think the president, they ask Hunt and Liddy to go back and put new bugs in. Hunt and Liddy turn again to the Cuban Americans. They meet at the Howard Johnson Motel and they go in. And while they're in, before they get a chance to penetrate the offices, they're caught by the police. Some guard has noticed the piece of tape on the door and they're caught. And if you think about it, and the whole point of this story is, that's where the movie begins, if some of you saw it. It begins with the break-in. Okay, bear with me. When did we learn about the secret B-52 bombing of Cambodia, which was the 4th item of impeachment against Richard Nixon? Putting bombs where nobody in Congress or in the government has authorized you to is basically equivalent to murder 1 in a lot of people's books. It was the 4th item of impeachment. We learned in May 73. When did we learn about the unconstitutional and illegal wiretaps, which are still being litigated by one Morton Halpern, one of the tappies, in federal court? We learned in May 73. When did we learn about the CIA activities against Chile? We learned in September 74. When did we learn about the CIA domestic spying at home? In December 74. When did we learn about the activities against Ellsberg et al. And the plumbers? May, June, July of 73. After what? They're all after one important date. They're after the 72 election. So I would say to you that my definition of the press and Watergate is this. If the American press had been able to penetrate any of the White House ongoing operations, and don't forget, by 1971, Richard Nixon, in acquiescent to a break-in, and again, Ellsberg's psychiatrist, he had put 110,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia over 14 months without getting caught. I mean, God, last thing he was afraid of was us. I would say that if the press had somehow managed to find one thing out in the first term of what I call the foreign policy Watergates, Nixon, Kissinger / Watergates, we might have had a couple of effects. One, we might have kept Nixon from himself. If he'd been caught out, let's say, bombing Cambodia, he might have been afraid to do the wiretapping, to have these clowns go back in and try and beat up people and go back into the wire, this nutty stuff they were doing. He might have hesitated twice on grounds that maybe he could get caught. Two, maybe you're not interested in having Nixon save himself from himself, but it's possible. The second thing is the Democratic nomination, for sure. If any of the thread could have begun to have been unraveled in 71, let's say. If a reporter could have written about 110,000 tons of bombs, it's almost amazing that we did not. We certainly had to see the holes. They were all over the place. Maybe the Democratic nomination would have been a little tougher, more hotly contested. Maybe it wouldn't have been left to George McGovern, a decent but certainly a sure loser. Maybe you would have had a more contested, a more viable nomination, certainly a more viable candidacy, certainly a more viable election process. Nixon could have won. I'm not saying he couldn't have, but it certainly would have been a lot tougher than it was. He swept everything, if you remember. McGovern got into did his 1,000% for Tom Eagleton. If you remember some of that. So what am I saying? I'm saying the press, far from having a victory in Watergate, in which everybody assumes that was exactly what happened. My reading of the history is simply this, that we, the press, by failing to meet any of the standards that you might normally expect us to have and hold in reporting on the Nixon White House, I think you could almost argue helped make Watergate, helped create it. Far from being the heroes of Watergate, we fell down so badly that we made Nixon, I guess we prevented Nixon from stopping himself, a little bit like people say Reagan should have been himself, and if Jim Baker and the others, Meese and Deaver, had been around, maybe Don Regan would have kept Reagan from being himself. I think the analogy is very exact. I guess the point is what I'm saying is, again, is that what this whole story shows is that if the president wants to lie and the people around him want to lie to us, don't expect us in the press to find out about it. We can't. If there's going to be a social revolution in the United States, don't expect us to lead it. We won't even know about it for 6 months, is another way of looking at it. So it isn't going to be in our bag. We in the press can't help you. Maybe you're not surprised, maybe, but a lot of people are. We can't do a thing for you. We can't do a single thing for you about it. And where are we going to do it? What's going to happen? Well, I don't know. In this case, in the case of this government, I think one of the things that's going to happen ultimately is we're going to have some political leader with enough courage to say that maybe our whole foreign policy should not be structured simply on stopping the Soviet-style communists. That maybe that a foreign policy that says it's okay to go into Grenada because somebody was threatened there. And our students, it's okay to do it because the Grenadians loved us for it. They do. They were certainly feeling under duress. The Grenadian citizens thought it was wonderful. Does that justify what we do? I would venture that if we went into Chile and released the people from Pinochet, the despot who's been ruling there, he took over and said, I'm going to stay in power 90 days. It's been a long 90 days. Is that our function too? Do we have an obligation to do that? I don't think so. And what does the world think about a country that can decide it can go into Grenada for purposes it believes to be just? That our national interest dictates that we, this country of 240 million, can go knock off a country of 110,000. What can we tell Mr. Gaddafi the next time he decides to go into Chad? That you can't operate in what you perceive to be your best interests, but we can do whatever we want in our best interests? That morality is at the end of our guns and our tanks and our fighters? Well, I think that's very short range. And I don't think there's anything we in the press can do for you. We cheerlead this stuff. I guess one answer is going to be maybe Congress, but you have to give Congress a D- too in the last 20, 30 years. Everybody knew in the Congress that Mr. William Casey of the CIA had two things going for him, basically. He's probably 30 IQ points smarter than anybody else in the government and 30 times as devious. Everybody knew he was selling them a bill of goods, but nobody had the guts to stand them up. Nobody would take on the Reagan people because Reagan was too popular. We had some amazing spectacle in the first term of Mr. Reagan. We had a case in which, some of you might remember when the Atlantic magazine published Mr. Stockman of the Office of Management, the budget director's sort of candid assessment. Bill Greider had a long piece on Stockman, December 1981, right at the time of the new budget, in which Stockman admitted that Donald Reagan's budget was a fraud, that his notion of cutting deficits and reducing taxes and spending more on defense simply was impossible, which should have been clear. So the Congress was confronted in early '82 with hearings on the new budget that said, of course, we can increase defense spending, cut taxes, and reduce the deficit. Congress was confronted with this budget. This was the White House was telling them. They had Stockman's testimony in the magazine that it was a total fraud. So what to do? The answer was to call Stockman and say to him, is that right? And Stockman says, no, the magazine's wrong. Congress says, oh, fine, and then proceeds to go through hearings on that budget as if indeed the magazine was wrong, and Stockman has simply misspoken to the reporter. And they marked up the budget as if nothing Stockman said. I fault the Congress as much as anybody. By the way, it's interesting, when Stockman wrote a book that I recommend to all of you, Stockman's book tells you more about Ronald Reagan than anything yet written. And of course, he was treated as a pariah. The press joined in trashing Stockman for being somebody who defected. And the message of the Stockman book was totally ignored. The message being that we had a presidency that was operating on the 6:30 News and nothing more. Well, I'm not shy about my opinions. I do remember this is the live free and die state. I presume some of you are really concerned about the importance of stopping communism, and we'll have a conversation. And I'd sort of like to get into it. I'm open for any question on anything that you want to ask me about. My basic thesis is, I guess to conclude, let me say something to you, that I'm a pessimist about the presidency. I don't think we're going to see any changes. There's nobody on the horizon that's going to treat it any differently. Whoever's going to, we are Jekyll and Hyde. You do understand that. When campaigning, God knows they come through here like crazy. I worked when McCarthy was campaigning for the presidency. He was campaigning against Lyndon Johnson. I was his press secretary and speechwriters in the New Hampshire campaign of '68. I have a cold. I was a speechwriter and press secretary, and on the road with him all the time. Spent a lot of time in New Hampshire, of course, in which we did all right in the write-in vote. And one of the things about it is that it's, gee whiz, let me tell you, it's terrific fun. Even if it's minus 12 in Berlin, right? You can go on downstairs in the morning and some guy's gotten up a half an hour before you and the car is going to be 72 degrees. And you're staying at the Ritz-Carlton as much as possible, drinking $7 glasses of orange juice. And you want something, it's Lear jets. Even then in '68 it was all Lear jets, private jets. And this fancy person, Paul Newman used to travel with us and stuff like that. Very exciting, wonderful time. And so what we have is a presidency, we have the kind of men who run for president, who are the kind of men who can say, gee, honey, take care of the kids, tie those shoelaces, brush that teeth for the next, 2 years. I'm on the road, it's total hell, dear. It's really rough. I'll see you. And he can just walk out, leave them all, without barely a backward glance. I mean, let's face it, when you're on the road, you're on the road. You simply can't be a parent and a husband when you're in a campaign. They don't work. It's impossible. And so the kind of guy has to be the kind of narcissistic guy who can view his importance to solving the world's problems, it's the way they view it, as so important that he's going to walk away from the family for a couple of years. Not an irrational trade-off for most people. If you have a chance to be president, well, you do it. But it does say something about certain values. We had a case where probably the classiest candidate for the Democrats, Dale Bumpers, just said no. There's too many other things I value. So the kind of guy that does it has the kind of narcissism and the kind of notion that he can tell 240 million people what to do, and that's the kind of way he looks at things. And his values are such that the value of worrying about kids and schools and grades and stuff like that aren't enough to keep him there. He's got to solve the world's problems. And so we get stunned when this man, once he gets elected, of course, one of the things we do in our society is he's our national leader, and the first lady is the first lady, and their family, and we're all family oriented in our society. And we're just stunned when we discover that our president hasn't seen his grandchild for 18 months since the grandchild's been born. Just stunned. And we're stunned when every one of their children does nothing more than write books ripping them off or give speeches ripping them off. We're just stunned that the family is like this. And the answer, of course, is that's what you get. That's the kind of people you get. That's the craziness of our society. You get this sort of narcissism-driven people. Raises a lot of profound questions in my mind about what you're going to vote for. What are we going to vote for? I guess we're going to have to look at, since no matter who you elect president, he immediately decides he's king. He is totally king. None of the common ordinary vicissitudes of life no longer have much to do with him. He's insulated from any reality, nothing but yes men. Anybody who's not a yes man is out the door in 2 minutes. I don't know what you do. How do you do it? I think the answer is when I vote again, assuming that the candidates are similar in social issues, I'm not going to worry about the foreign policy issue because I know they're going to be the same. They've always been the same. They're going to get in trouble and kick the commies and invade a country if they have to. If not Nicaragua, something else to look good and get a lot of points from the press, and the press will go along with them totally. I guess I'm going to look at the integrity factor. Try and find somebody who I feel has more integrity than the other guy. It's a crazy way to do it, but that's where I'm at. And something may change, something may not. We're still a wonderful country. We can exist despite all these things. But our national leadership doesn't have the integrity that any of you have in your family. And I think that's a reality. Let's do some questions. Yes, I'll repeat them.